You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Tim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Timbuktu.
Authors. I have a fantastic new service to tell you about. It's called PubSite. PubSite is a service to help you build your very own website, your home on the web, where you can promote your work and give your fans a place to connect with you. PubSite is a website platform that allows every author, regardless of budget, to have a great-looking professional website developed by the book marketing professionals at FSB Associates. PubSite is the new, easy-to-use DIY website builder developed specifically for books and authors. Whether you're an author of one book or 20, or a small publisher, PubSite allows you to build, design, and most importantly, update your website pain-free. No need to be dependent on a designer or webmaster to make a small but costly change to your website. Save the money and do it yourself. PubSite is the best platform for authors because it's a book-centric platform. PubSite was built just for authors and small publishers. Every design, feature, and layout is book-centric. They have customized designs for you to use. It's easy to build. No coding or HTML is necessary to create a stunning, professional-looking website with all the features you want. Get a custom domain name, yourname.com. It's simple to update. You can add all of your books, add a blog and a book tour, sell from any retailer, manage your email list and social media, and even do e-commerce. Build your website with a 14-day free trial, then pay just $19.99 per month, which includes hosting. And we offer packages starting at $499 to set up the website for you. Pub-site.com, the place to help authors find their home on the web. Beware the Chinaman by Stephen Taylor. The future is electric, but who holds the power? Sent by government agent Howard to pick up a stolen hard drive, Danny soon finds himself fighting for his life as he's chased across Europe by the mysterious and deadly Chinaman. The hard drive holds information to expose an organization called the Board, and its chairman wants it back. The Board's plan is to save the planet and gain global dominance through its ecological empire. The execution of the plan is by any means necessary. Beware the Chinaman, the new thriller by Stephen Taylor. Unleashing Iron, Book 3 of the Unwilling Souls series by Gregory D. Little, arrives April 24th and is available for pre-order now. Seslukani has one mission: keep humankind's murderous gods imprisoned. She's about to fail. The gods have achieved the unthinkable, inhabiting human avatars from within their prison's walls. They now gather followers and work to break it open from the outside. One of those avatars is Sess's own father. Just as all seems lost, Sess learns of a recently unearthed artifact so powerful that it can repair the prison and save her father from the possession that is killing him. But in the wrong hands, the artifact could demolish the prison instead of repairing it, and it's already been stolen. In a desperate race to control the object that will save or end the world, Sess faces a devastating choice as she realizes that no one is immune to the artifact's ancient promise of forgotten power. Not her family, not her friends, not even herself. Unleashing Iron is available for pre-order now. Order before April 24th to get the special sale price. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm super excited to have Jason Diakite on the show with me today. You might know him by his stage name, Timbuktu. He's a very successful Swedish rapper and author, and excited to talk with him today about his new book, A Drop of Midnight. Welcome to the show, Jason.
Thanks for having me, Hank. So happy to be able to be on your show.
Excited to have you, and I know we're under auspicious circumstances with the way things are happening in the world right now. We were both talking just for a minute before we started recording about the internet is not great because everyone's working from home, and so we're just excited to get to connect.
It is a momentous shift in this moment that we are existing. It's incredible, and it's happening all across the globe.
It's crazy. I don't think 2 months ago any of us could have predicted that life would be the way it is right now. But here we are, and we get to make the best of it and talk about my favorite thing in the world, and that's books and the people that write them. Jason, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Wow. I have, ever since I learned how to read, and I learned pretty late, I would say. I think I was about 7 when I learned how to read. But from the moment I learned to read, I instantly fell in love with reading, and reading was my, prime mean of escape, but also of travel, of exploration, of discovery. And I think probably at the ages 11 or 12, I formulated for myself that one day I want to write at least one book. That's my one goal that I want to achieve in life, is at least writing one book. But being an avid reader from childhood and on, I was always very kind of respectful and fearful for that, feeling more and more like, well, I'm not well equipped enough verbally or focus wise to actually be able to write a book like these fantastic authors that I love reading. But yeah, so no, I would say from about 12 years old, I think that seed to want to write was first planted in me.
Gotcha. Were you you're probably best known right now for your music career. When were you introduced? Well, I started to say when were you introduced to music, but that's kind of one of those things that's that we're just around all the time. But when were your eyes and ears opened to the fact that that you might have some musical ability, and kind of when did those possibilities open for you?
So I grew up in a small town called Lund, which is in the south of Sweden, the very, very southern tip of Sweden. And in the 80s, growing up in Lund, I was, of course, listening to a lot of Michael Jackson and Prince and Madonna and these untouchable pop gods that that every kid was listening to in the 80s. But my cousin Joey was sent to live with us, and he lived in Brooklyn. But my aunt, his mom, sent him to live with his uncle, my dad, in Lund in 1989. And Joey brought a bunch of cassettes with hip-hop music on them. And he, 3 of them, he might have had more, but the 3 that I remember are the Jungle Brothers album, Straight Out the Jungle. He had an LL Cool J album, which I think was bad, and Public Enemy, It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back. And hearing, and my cousin Joey was 2 years older than me. He was from Brooklyn. I thought he was really cool. I was super impressed by him. And then hearing this music that he would listen to, I was just drawn to it. It was like nothing I had heard before. I mean, I had heard some hip hop songs, but all of a sudden I had this a 2-year-older kid from Brooklyn who knew all the lyrics to the songs that he was playing for me. And I just fell in love with hip hop music. And I was 14 at the time, and I think that it was only a few weeks later that I started writing my own lyrics. So it was pretty instant that I wanted to actually make my own rap songs, and aspire to do something like these amazing rappers that I was listening to.
Well, and you said that you had, obviously heard some hip hop before that, but it probably, I'm thinking back to 1989, probably some of, whatever was the commercial kind of top 40, crossover hits that had happened at the time, and going from that to, Public Enemy and hearing like Chuck D and a consummate storyteller of, in his own right, that had to just be like mind-opening to the possibilities.
It was totally amazing. And also I remember that he had the Slick Rick album too, the Slick Rick the Rule. And speaking of storytelling, I mean, listening to the song Children's Story on Slick Rick's first album it just shows you what rap can be and what it can do. And then somebody like Chuck D, very an agitator, politically aware. It was something very attainable in these rappers that I hadn't felt when listening to the Princes and Michael Jacksons and Madonnas, that were more like these untouchable gods whose like clothing, style, and genius no like mere mortal could ever touch. But these rappers were standing on the streets, dressed in their own style and talking about their neighborhoods and their lives and their families and what was going on in their cities and in the world they lived in. And I just felt like, yeah, I can, this is totally something I can do. Now, bear in mind, I mean, it took me a few years before I would say my craft was honed to the point where it actually started sounding good. But at the time, everything I wrote, I felt, oh, this is great. This is amazing. And then the next song I wrote, I was like, oh, this is even better than the previous one. And it was just a rabbit hole that just was bottomless, basically. And in a sense, I'm still in it. And, that initial love that I had for hip hop and that the enthusiasm with which I started writing my own rap lyrics, I haven't felt again since 2000. I hadn't felt until 2015 when I started writing A Drop of Midnight. Because up until that point, like I was saying, I dreamt of like, well, one day I want to write a book, but I'm not a writer, so I'll never be able to pull that, mountain climb off. But deciding that I was going to attempt, sitting in January 2015 with my dad, having a cup of coffee, and him telling me a story, or telling me the story about how in 1965 he was living in Harlem, New York, but he had a girlfriend that lived in Harlem, Georgia. And he was going to move to his girlfriend's in Harlem, Georgia. And he jumped in his car and drove from New York City. And outside of Lexington, South Carolina, he got pulled over. And this is 1965, mind you. He was pulled over by the state trooper. And then they handed him over to the sheriff. Or the state trooper handed him over to the sheriff. The sheriff impounded his car. And my dad had to sleep in a motel. And my dad being, scared that something was going to happen to him, that somebody might come and lynch him, he didn't dare sleep in the motel room, but climbed up in a tree and spent the night in a tree. And the next day, he jumped on the bus and finally made it to Harlem, Georgia.
That is such a crazy story.
Being the place where he would. Where he'd most likely, to me, it was just so ironic that, he sought refuge and shelter in this tree, but that would also be the place where if his fears came true, that's where he would be strung up, right? So after having that cup of coffee with him and having him tell me that story, I went home, I wrote it down. It was about, 3 pages on my of a Word document. And I just instantly felt like, well, let me see if I can unearth some more stories from my dad. I know all of my childhood and growing up, he's been telling me stories about family. My mom has been telling me stories about family. Let me capture some of these stories and write them down. And maybe that could be a book. And after having written this first story of how my dad is traveling from Harlem, New York to Georgia, I felt like, well, this, my writing, these 3 pages, they read really great. And then I got another story from my dad. I wrote that down, and I was like, well, this is way better than what I wrote before. And it kept going like that. It was that same type of feeling, like for each thing I wrote, for each week, I was getting better at this craft, and it just charged me with a lot of enthusiasm that I think helped me carry out and actually complete writing the book.
Let's back up for just a second, yeah. Jason. And I love that that idea of kind of self-exploration and I think we all come to a point, as we're maturing and coming into our own, where we want to know more about where we come from and what people came before us and what prices did they pay that allowed us to be who we are, or what struggles did they go through, or what victories did they have that we can stake some sort of claim on, that we get to be a part of this. I think that's part of maturing is the looking back.
Yeah.
You grew up in Sweden, as you mentioned, in a small town in southern Sweden. I think Lund is the town.
Exactly.
To hear you talk, you have the perfect English and even a slight East Coast American accent.
Yeah.
How does that happen when you grow up in Sweden?
So my dad is an African American and my mom is white American, and they moved to Lund in 1969. Lund, to describe it to your listeners and to an American audience, I usually say is kind of the equivalent of a Cambridge, England, or let me see if I could think of a small town that's a college town in the United States. But I usually compare it to a Cambridge, England, because it's a very small town, but has a large university with 40,000 students. And the university is basically the foundation of the city life and the culture or the town life and the culture in the town. And my mom and dad moved there because they had met 3 years earlier in 1966. My mom was working as a social worker, and she knocked on a door one day because she was looking for a runaway girl. And she knocked on a door on 110th Street and 8th Avenue, and my dad answered the door and fell in love. What's that?
I said, wow, that just the coincidence.
Yeah. Yeah. No, so they met, they fell in love, which was, of course, highly unusual at the time. Started dating, and then the relationship became serious. And as it became serious, both my mom's family and my dad's family really dawned on them that, wait a minute, these kids are serious about this, but we can't have this. On my dad's side, they were like, you can't marry a white girl. What are you doing? And of course, my mom's family had the same sentiments. This is just not done. What are our friends going to say? What do this is irresponsible. It's impossible. Where are you going to live? But my mom had already, when they met, my mom had graduated from college because her parents put her through college. My dad is from a poor working class family in Harlem, and nobody there had gone to college, and nobody could afford to put him through college either. So he found out that he could study in Sweden in English for free. And in 1969, managed to get my mom on board on the plan that, they'd move to Sweden for 3-4 years while he got his education, and then they'd move back to New York. So that's how they ended up in Sweden.
And just never left.
And got stuck. And are still here. They're still in Lund to this day,
Wow. Yeah. So I heard you say one time, Jason, on a YouTube video or something, you told this great story about there was a semantic shift in the way that you described yourself. You said that you used to say you were half Swedish and half American because you had American parents, but you grew up in Sweden, and you felt like you were half black and half white. And that it to me, what I took from that is that you felt kind of torn between two worlds, torn between two nationalities, torn between two cultural upbringings, maybe. And then but you made this semantic shift from being half of one, half of the other, to being both. I'm both Swedish, both American. I'm both black, both white. Could you talk a little bit about that and what that means to embracing being uniquely who you are without limiting the pieces that make you who you are?
Absolutely. I growing up with a dad that didn't look like me and a mom that didn't look like me, I really, from about the age of 7, from when at the time in the 80s, kids would start first grade when they were 7 years old. And from the time I started first grade, I was teased and bullied. It started with teasing, but evolved into bullying by the same 3 gang of boys. And they would call me all types of names because based on the color of my skin. And it really made me realize that I didn't look like anyone else in my school. I was only one of, there were only 3 kids of color in my entire school at the time. And it just was the beginning of this identity crisis for me. And I couldn't get the pieces to fit because I didn't look like my dad. I didn't look like my mom. And they couldn't fully understand this feeling of halfness that I was carrying and that was born in me at that point. And I think that feeling of halfness or feeling of in-betweenness stayed with me and grew and was something that lodged deep inside of me and that I carried, and to a sense still carry, but really carried in a painful way for many, many years until about 10 years ago when I realized that rather than me describing myself, because in my description, when people would ask me, where are you from? Who are you? I would say, I'm half Swedish, half American, or half black, half white. So no part of me being completely complete. And in my own self-description, that incompleteness is in there. I just realized, well, I'm black and white. And that small semantic step was a gigantic identity leap for me, just to start describing myself in a different way and allowing myself to own all the identities and all the cultures and the backgrounds and roots that I have. So, I mean, as I always tell, especially when I'm talking to young people, words really matter. And the words that we use to describe ourselves matter. And the words we use to describe the world as we see it matter. So to me, that just shifting from half to both, it's just a change of words, but it's made a huge difference. And I think landing in that that's actually more 8 years ago, that was my first step in realizing that I wanted to map out and write down my family background, trace my roots, and tell the stories of the people that are my ancestors, and basically map out where I'm from.
And so, like, as you told us earlier, you start having these conversations with your father and writing down his stories and getting that firsthand account. You also, kind of became the family chronicler and gathering everyone's stories. You also made some pilgrimages that expanded your understanding, gave you some on the ground understanding. Talk about going to some of the places, some of the stories, and connecting with your older ancestors.
Absolutely. I in the process of writing this book, at the outset of starting to write it, I was, I was nagging my dad literally to tell me stories about things and bombarding him with questions about our family and our ancestors, and doing the same with my mom and calling relatives in the States and so forth. And one thing is that I was born in Sweden in 1975. In 1983, both my paternal grandfather and paternal grandmother died within 2 weeks of each other. So I had met them, because we would always travel to New York in the summers and sometimes for Christmas. But I didn't really have, I was young. I was only, 8 years old when they passed. And I didn't, at the outset of writing A Drop of Midnight, I really started thinking a lot about my grandfather and my grandmother, and had a strong urge to get to know them. But of course, they had long since passed. So how would I do that? And my dad would tell me stories, but I wanted to know, what did my grandfather feel like? Like, what type of man was he? Not just the, where he worked and how he dressed and the old photos and the stuff that my dad was telling me. I wanted to know more about what sort of a man he was and how he carried himself and so forth. And he was born in 1907 in a small town called Allendale in South Carolina. Surrounded by cotton fields at the time. And his family, they were sharecroppers, and he himself, at the age of 5, did what everybody else, all his cousins, aunts, and uncles did. He picked cotton, but left at the age of 13, which to me was very intriguing. Like, how did he leave? Why did he leave? How did he manage to break out of that situation that none of the rest of his family had managed at that point? So the more I was writing, the more I wrote, I started to realize that I have to go to Allendale, to both look for traces of him, but also just to feel the atmosphere, smell the air, see the houses, the landscapes, get a feel of what the place might have felt like for him. And it was a truly momentous journey for me. I flew down to Charleston, rented a car, and then drove inland about 2 hours to get to Charleston. And as I'm approaching Allendale, I look out of the car window and I see this endless, vast field where the cotton is high. And I just instinctively stopped the car because it hadn't dawned on me that the cotton field still existed, that the cotton still grew. And, just seeing this vast field of cotton, I was like, well, this is exactly what it must have looked like in grandfather's day, and what it must have looked like in my great-great-grandfather's day, too. The only thing missing here is black and brown bodies, picking the cotton. I stopped my car, I jumped out, I crossed the ditch and walked into the field and just started picking cotton. I just wanted to feel and try to connect to the ghosts, of my ancestors. And to me, it was a very, very strong moment of connection to them. It was I was in that field for what, 10, 15 minutes, picking cotton, as much cotton as I could fit into the paper bag that was under my arm. But it gave me just the slightest hint and to what their lives might have been like and what they must have felt like, you know.
It's a very visceral experience too. If when those bowls stab you in the fingers and you start thinking about the calluses that you would have to build up that's an experience everyone should have at least once.
And then driving into Allendale and in the surroundings of Allendale, seeing that the plantation houses were still there with fresh coats of paint, cotton fields are still there, witnessing firsthand the poverty that was so striking and alarmingly present there. Not only did I realize why my grandfather had to leave in I guess what must have been about 1920, but even today, if he were born today, he would have to leave too, you know. And I just landed it just landed in me this feeling of deep gratitude that he had the courage that he seized the moment and was able to break free, because it really changed the trajectory of his future generation. So basically, the fact that I'm standing on my privilege rests on the shoulders of his migration and his strength and courage to be able to break out of that and make his way to Harlem and make a better life for himself, which in turn enabled my dad and mom to break free from Harlem and move to Sweden for the same purpose, to find a better space of opportunity. So in writing this book and in thinking deeply about what my ancestors might have felt, what they must have felt, how their lives must have played out, really brought me very close to that feeling of gratitude and that realization that there's so many generations of sacrifice, courage, and resilience and survival, really, that has produced me and has enabled my life, you know.
And what a beautiful story it is. You could have written this book as a family history, but you wrote it as a memoir, which gives us a window into you, Jason, as you're experiencing these things. As you start collecting these stories and, like the ones that you collected from your dad and wrote down initially, and then start asking questions and doing the digging and doing the visiting of all that of your own, and you start writing these things down, how did you find the narrative thread that would be this book? Like, how do you pick the window that you allow us to look into your life through for A Drop of Midnight?
It's an interesting question, Hank. The meta narrative of the book is actually my search for the story, my search for the answers. So the book begins in 2015 when I set out to start writing it, and how I, try to get my dad to tell me stories and my mom to tell me stories, and then how I then fly to Allendale, to Baltimore. I go to Manning, to Alabama, to Louisiana, and of course Harlem. So the book is also the narrative of the book is also my searching for the story, for the answers of who my ancestors were and what they must have felt. And so I injected myself into the narrative of my family as me being this kid that grew up in Sweden, far away from where my ancestors were born and where their lives played out. But me wondering wondering about who they were and always having this longing to go back to the United States. And also my own experiences with racism because of the color of my skin, juxtaposing that against the societies and cultures where, and times that my grandparents and great grandparents lived in, and my own parents too. So I thought it would be interesting, would be more interesting for the reader to read it seen through my eyes than me just a kind of mapping out it more biographically and genealogically about who my family was and leaving myself out of it.
Well, A Drop of Midnight is an amazing book. I thoroughly enjoyed it, Jason. It really gave me, looking at these situations through your eyes, through someone who grew up in Sweden, is a completely new outlook that I didn't expect, and honestly wasn't quite prepared for. But I love it, and I really enjoyed your experience as told in the book. The book is available everywhere now. There's links to it in the show notes of this episode. Jason, if people are just learning about you and want to dig into all the amazing stuff that you do, is there a place where they can connect with you online?
So I'm on Facebook under Timbuktu. I'm, of course, on Instagram. My handle is Jason TMBK. And, I have a lot of my music, of course, on YouTube. So you can find under Timbuktu, and you can find a lot of that there. And adropofmidnight.com is the site for the book, where you can purchase the book. And also I turned the book into a stage performance and wrote music to it, where I tell the story, an abbreviated version, of course, of the book, set to music on stage with a live band. And that was supposed to have opened at Harlem Stage in New York City, March 30th. But because of the ongoing global pandemic, that has been postponed until October, where I really pray to all the gods and powers that be and the ancestors that our world has moved through this terrifying time. So A Drop of Midnight will premiere on October 13th at Harlem Stage in New York City. All this information you can find on adropofmidnight.com.
Amazing. I can't wait to see how that turns out. I know it's going to be wildly successful. Jason, this has been so much fun chatting about A Drop of Midnight and your story. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me, Hank. And let me just say as parting words that it makes me so immensely happy and grateful for my story to be able to travel back across the Atlantic and reach American readers, because I think, just as you're saying, that my Swedish perspective on a very well-known American story is something that I'm happy and so excited to share with American readers.
Absolutely. We're going to send everyone to see you, Jason, and stay safe out there, brother.
Thank you so much, my man. Take care, Hank.
All right. Before We Ever Spoke by Dan Largent. Cleveland, Ohio, 2006. After a chance encounter, three people soon find out that life can sometimes thrust us into the public eye, even when taking great measures to avoid it. Cooper Madison was the best pitcher in baseball after being drafted number 1 overall in 1996 from the small Gulf Coast town of Pass Christian, Mississippi. 1 year after announcing his sudden and shocking retirement, he finds himself seeking anonymity in Cleveland, Ohio. Kara Knox is the youngest sibling to 3 older brothers. After a tragic work accident to her closest relative, she has built up a tough exterior as she begins her final year of college at Cleveland State University. Jason Knox, Kara's oldest brother, is the lead detective on Cleveland's Edgewater Park killer case. After months without a suspect, he's feeling the heat from his media-hungry chief. Serendipity intervenes, and all three learn that perception and reality are paths that rarely ever intersect. Before We Ever Spoke by Dan Largent. Hey folks, you really ought to check out Patricia Gillam's Heroes of Corvus series. Book 1 is called A Superhero's Duty. A fight between a second-generation superhero named Red Bolt and a villain for hire named Icarus goes terribly wrong, resulting in the drowning deaths of 3 innocent civilians and orphaning a 6-year-old boy. Racked with guilt, Red Bolt visits Cameron Wilson at the hospital every night and won't leave the boy's side until he falls asleep. Befriended by a night shift nurse, the man in costume begins to disclose what really happened after the fight and why he feels the death of Cameron's parents and sister fall on his actions. A superhero didn't survive that night, and Cameron and the rest of the city are not out of danger. A Superhero's Duty, Book 1 of the Heroes of Corvus by Patricia Gillam. Get this series now.